All right, what is up, guys? We are live here with Rami from New York and Harrison from Georgia, once again doing a capitalism versus socialism debate. I'm going to stay out of this one by popular demand from last one. But yeah, I will let Rami go ahead and give his opening statement.
All right. So capitalism has been a driving force in our world in terms of innovation, human success, overall benefit of people, and fits perfectly with human psychology, where areas as a full-on socialist economy does not really provide a full long time standard.
Okay, and my criticisms of capitalism are pretty basic. It is inherently an exploitive system. It is inherently an undemocratic system, and is a system where decision making is built entirely upon what is profitable.
So when you bring up the fact that like let's say someone is doing something, right? Like building some like crafting something like a house, essentially there's an opportunity cost that's being used in that. So essentially like someone is going to need an incentive fact that they use their labor, they use their time, they use their skill in order to like make something like a house. Like the perfect commodity to really come back with that is a value with money. I mean, unless you, because that's the only standard we can have to trade with, unless like, because everyone's gonna have to agree to something they're gonna agree to. So why would someone who has specific skill in building a house rather, like instead of guessing about what they want, money is a good commodity for this in response.
Wait, what's your argument that you need money to like
Well, it's
allocate
not, it's
resources?
not like you need money, but like it's like in capitalism, right? You need like a response, like in human standards. So we all need shelter, we all need food, that kind of stuff. So like essentially, people are gonna want what their labor is worth.
Yeah, they are, and they don't get that under capitalism. I'm confused. Like if they,
Uh,
if you're saying they want what their labor is worth, in capitalism they're not going to get what their labor is worth.
there's like, have you heard of Adam Smith's Invisible Hand?
I'm sort of familiar with it. Yeah.
Yeah, so essentially it determines like what the buyers are willing to pay for and what the sellers are willing to go for. So essentially the um the invisible hand will determine the fact that people are only willing to buy what they're willing to pay for. So essentially if the invisible hand, right, if someone's doing labor to build a house, essentially the buyers will determine the price of it and they will get a full response in terms of their labor,
Well,
which
this is not necessarily true. You brought up housing.
yeah.
Housing is not really like that, right? You're gonna need to have a house, so the buyer really doesn't have much power in the say of what kind of housing gets produced.
Well, there's different types of houses that can be done. I mean,
Yeah, we have a
and
huge demand in this country for affordable housing, but the housing market does not provide it.
well, essentially, one of the reasons for unaffordable housing is due to government rent control. I would say, I would argue.
Where in the US do we have government rent control?
I mean, like housing price, like there is rent controls in the U.S. Like, uh,
Not on a large scale at all, really. Is there a single city that has rent control?
yeah, I could even bring up the let's see, rent control. Yeah, there are different states of rent control, including mine, New York. There are essentially ones, and essentially when you bring up the idea for people to extract their labor for a service. Essentially, people are not going to want to craft a special type of house if they don't get their money's worth in terms of it.
So this is the whole like profit is like a driver of innovation. Is that what you're like trying to
Yeah,
get at, or we need
essentially.
profit to like create?
So essentially, why should someone, right, that that takes the time to build a whole like 5-story house? Let's just figuratively say, let's just hypothetically say a 5-story house, right? Why should someone with a 5-story house essentially deem themselves for a minor profit, essentially?
Yeah, I'm just not of the belief that humans need profit to like create goods or innovate. I mean, capitalism is a system that has only existed for like the last couple hundred years, yet, you know, We were able to produce goods. We were able to innovate. We were able to provide the needs of communities and societies. So yeah, I don't think a market or even profit is a really good, driver of that kind of stuff.
But as we've adopted more capitalist policies, more benefits have come to the world. Essentially, if you want to talk about gender equality, if you want to talk about
Well, what is gender equality have to do with capitalism? The USSR was like one of the pioneers of like gender equality. It was one of the first countries to make abortion like fully legalized.
right, but relatively, if you look in
And
the
Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso, a huge proponent of women's rights. So this is a completely separate issue from capitalism.
of course, but I'm just saying like there's many benefits, and if you look at economically free country and you compare them, like if you also compare happiness, people are more happier in economically free countries. There's actually less deforestation in economically free countries. In fact, in economically free countries, there are actually an increase in forests, believe it or
What are
not.
we using to say a country is economically free?
Well, we can either use the Fraser Institute or we can use Heritage Foundation. Both are reliable and both.
Both are which are highly like fraudulent and borderline propaganda. The Heritage Foundation one doesn't even measure the regulation we typically associate. It says nothing about labor protections. It says nothing about environmental regulations. It says nothing about like consumer liability. All it has to do with is the cost to start a business, the ability to close a business, how much it is to get electricity. It really doesn't have a lot to do with the type of regulation we typically talk about.
I mean, let me go to it real quick. It does talk about that. It talks about business freedom, it incorporates labor freedom and monetary freedom on the
Yeah,
side of it.
it's not measuring the regulations we're thinking about. So like if there's environmental regulation, that's just not a part of the economic freedom index.
Right, but I'm just saying there's a correlation. It's not part of that, but if you actually view the correlation between the economically freer countries, there is actually a higher standard of
Well,
forestation.
I don't really care if there's a correlation. We need to establish a causation. And if you want to talk about happiness, standard of living, it's not really economic freedom that leads to that. The Nordic countries, which are apparently very economically free according to those indexes, they actually have such high standards of living because of their welfare programs and their high rates of unionization, not because of apparently economic freedom.
Well, their economic freedom allows them to have a surplus of wealth, which allows them to actually have these social welfare programs. If you actually want to go down the
How
list,
how does economic freedom what? Okay, so how is their welfare programs a result of economic freedom? Welfare programs aren't economic freedom. Like
because they have a surplus in revenue, right, which allows them to increase which allows them to put some of these funds back into what we call welfare programs.
yeah, and those welfare programs are like the reason why they have such high standards of living, not
Um,
economic freedom. I mean, without those programs, they wouldn't have as high a standard of living.
I mean, you could also compare the fact that socialist countries had these, right, back when socialism was a much more mainstream idea in the 20th century. But at the same time, people were not happy in these countries. People wanted to leave all the time, right?
What metric are you using to say that? Because historically, there have been research into this. Countries of similar economic development that are socialist have higher physical qualities of life than capitalist ones.
Actually, infant mortality, for example, like birth
Yeah,
rates
infant mortality rate is one of the metrics they used in that study.
will have a study that shows life expectancy has increased due to capitalism over the last 40 years.
Again,
Um,
there's no causal relationship there.
so, so why would you say that if
Because
so
socialist countries are far more likely to bring reforms to education, healthcare, and agriculture that actually improve the physical quality of life in the countries. That's why the highest country in Africa, the highest human development index, is a socialist one.
well, you would also take into account the fact that research is pushed through competition and through profits, honestly.
No, it's not.
Yeah, it is. So
Research is done almost exclusively by the public sector.
yeah, it is done by the public sector, but like the reason that people want to even incentivize this, the reason people want to gain profits through this, is through the fact that capitalism is a thing. Like
No,
people
but
use
the people who develop the innovations in the public sector, they don't get the profits from when it's patented.
well, the companies they work for
No,
clearly get
they don't. The company they work for is the U.S. government. Like the public research institutions are the biggest driver of innovation. They don't get the profit from when capitalists take their innovation and monetize it.
right. So the U.S. government actually gains like some revenues through the hospitals, through the taxes grown through it. Like people from all over the world come to the U.S. for their healthcare services.
I mean, if
Uh,
they can afford it. I
I
mean,
mean,
the U.S. has a huge problem right now with people leaving because they can't afford their healthcare.
well, there's like in some of these countries where there's universal health care, some people don't like it due to wait times. There's a huge black market. And like I would know that people all over the world come to hospitals to the US, and
I
even though
mean,
they have universal health care, because like my mom actually works in a hospital where she's not a doctor, but she works in international services where people from all over the world, I mean for people from specific countries where there are universal health care, end up actually requesting to go to the hospital, even though the fact that their country can essentially have it for free, as opposed to the hospital she works at where it actually costs money.
well, countries with universal healthcare typically have better wait times in the US. The only area where it's really worse, and it's not much worse, is the areas of specialized and elective treatment. Every other area of medicine, they actually have better wait times in the US. So,
So why do people all over the world would come to the U.S. for healthcare?
they don't. There's not that many. The only people coming into the US for healthcare are like really wealthy people trying to get our admittedly very good doctors and hospitals. Most people in other countries are perfectly fine to just use their own nation's healthcare. Like if you have a Saudi monarch, of course he's going to come to the US for his healthcare.
So I have a study right here. Approximately about 80,000 visits to U.S. healthcare facilities occur by Canadians, right? Which and Canada apparently has one of the best um, healthcare services in the world. But apparently a lot of them actually want to end up coming to the U.S. for healthcare. I can
Well,
send
okay,
you more.
Canada has healthcare wait times that are like uniquely bad for like public systems. But even in that sense, it's only 80,000. Over 1 million Americans leave the country for healthcare.
But how are they going to provide in other countries when these are funded by tax revenues?
Because in those other countries, you can just go there and get the healthcare.
Hmm.
It's medical tourism. It's a big thing right now. People go to Mexico, India.
But then again, the U.S. also leads in innovation in terms of medical advancements as well,
Yeah,
which is
because we are the wealthiest country. That's why.
well, why do you think we have all this wealth? Because we are a capitalist-based country, and the reason we're able to do
I never denied capitalism makes the wealthy extraordinarily wealthy.
right, but look, if you want a socialized country, we're not going to be able to develop all these medicines. We're not going to be able to develop all the
Dude, okay. I believe it is 19 of the last 20 like award winners and like medical innovations got their funding for their research from the National Institute of Health. It goes back to the point that a lot of research, including medical research, is done in the public sector.
Yeah, I mean, of course, but the revenues, the profits, they end up all coming back to the healthcare industry. Again, I wasn't denying the public sector, but I was
You
simply
you said you said innovation was because we are capitalist. Is that wrong?
yeah,
Did you say that?
that's why people are trying to develop these medicines.
But the medicines are developed in the public sector.
Yeah, they're developing public sector, but the reason that people want to do it in the public sector to promote the medicines is due to our entrepreneurship type society.
But the people in the public sector don't benefit from the pharmaceutical companies like patenting these drugs.
Well, who do you think is hiring them? Like the government, so that they can earn some revenue, right, through taxation.
What do you, what is what does that have to do with the point?
Taxation through
The
growth.
government hires them, yeah, to do the research.
Yeah, so then essentially these hospitals will gain the GDP numbers, the growth, they will all end up growing through the US because these people have a push.
Again, if it weren't for the public research, we wouldn't have those innovations. It's not thanks to capitalism, it's thanks to the state.
Again, like I'm not denying that part, but what I am
Okay, then don't say innovation is caused by capitalism.
I am because what's the whole motive of these drives? Why are
The
governments
public
doing it?
sector is capitalist now. Is that what you're
How
saying?
is the government going to gain revenue then?
Yes, they collect revenue from its citizens when we are a capitalist nation, but that doesn't mean capitalism is responsible for the innovation. It's not
So,
taking place in a market, it's not taking place by private companies, it's taking place through the government.
but then the government is being funded through
Can
these.
we not collect taxes in a socialist society? Is that impossible?
I'm not saying that, but there is more
Okay,
of
then why does it matter?
because there's more of a push with healthcare industries under capitalism, right? So that gains
Why?
more revenue for these countries, right? That's why these Nordic countries are able to have a welfare net because there is a revenue coming in from these economies.
Again, welfare states have existed in nations that are not capitalist, and the public sector and private sector are completely separate. And innovation can take place in the public sector, get transferred or monetized in the private sector, and the people in the public sector who are responsible for that innovation don't get any of the profit.
So when you bring up the fact that welfare states have these as socialist countries, but there's a reason why they can't last so long. There's a reason why the welfare and socialist states can't last so long. Like there's a reason why these socialist countries abandoned. Like look at Sweden, right? Sweden was a socialist relative country, relatively socialist, and then they ended
When?
up. Hmm?
When?
They were in at least some point in the 20th century, right?
I don't believe so. I think they might have been a little bit more left, but recently they've moved more really
Yeah, recently.
neoliberal. I don't think I would ever call them socialist. No.
I mean, I would, but essentially, I do believe they've moved to more free market policies, and as they move to as countries have moved through more free market policies to continuously have these welfare programs because of a net surplus.
I mean, they're moving away from these programs not because the programs didn't work, but because the capitalists don't want the programs. I mean,
I mean,
they had a welfare, no, they had a wealth tax for about, I think it was like 115 years, and they just recently got rid of it
I talk about the wealth
because
tax within the U.S.
the billionaires don't really like a wealth tax. So of course they're going to lobby the government to get rid of it and favor politicians who are more neoliberal.
Actually, when there was a much higher tax, essentially a lot of these company, a lot, I'm sorry, not a lot of these companies, a lot of these billionaires were actually able to like negotiate with avoiding some of these taxes. If you actually look at it, billionaires actually pay more in taxes way more taxes than the average public. Like if we just put like the 1% together and stack it up against the 99%, we actually
Wait,
see
which country are we talking about?
the U.S. in terms of when you brought up the wealth tax essentially.
Yeah, of course they pay more in taxes, but if you actually look at the rate of taxes, it's never been lower. And in fact, is lower than a lot of middle class people.
Let me bring up the source, right? Yes,
Like
tax.
no one, you're gonna find no one who denies that they pay more in taxes. But when you look at the rate, it's never been lower. It's lower than a lot of middle class people.
And yet our country leads in
And
innovation.
like we used to have over a 90% top marginal tax rate.
Yeah, that's essentially what I'm covering, the 90% marginal tax rate. But actually, people were able to avoid paying these.
Wait, do you think a 90% marginal tax rate means people pay 90% of their income?
No, I don't mean that they pay 90% of their income. They pay 90% after they make like if you're talking about Alexandria Ocasio Cortez, right? The 70% tax rate will essentially cover about 10 million. I mean, after they make their $10 million,
Yeah,
right?
this is how marginal
But
tax rates work.
yeah,
The
I'm
marginal
saying
tax rate back then was 90%, and they were still paying about a 50% effective rate, much higher than what it is right now.
But essentially, what you have to look at is the fact that there is more innovation over time. There's more companies being brewed up, right? When you have less taxes, essentially,
I
you
mean,
have more
the
companies that
time in which we had the highest marginal tax rates were also the golden age of middle class expansion in this country.
I would argue the reason that people have been struggling, I mean, the reason that the middle class has been dying is due to overspending, which there's
Overspending, overspending by
yeah,
whom?
because we have an increase in military expenditures, and then we also have an increase in more welfare. Because ever since Lyndon B. Johnson's war on poverty, right? Ever
How
since
is how has that hurt the middle class?
because the middle class is going to have a tax burden, and some people are incentivized to stay on welfare.
I mean, okay, so back during the middle class expansion, we had exceptionally high taxes. And the bit about welfare, those economic stability programs you talked about have been
Mhm.
extremely effective at reducing poverty.
Actually, the curve has actually been like when you bring up if you bring up the fact that 35 to 17% the poverty rate, it was actually already increasing to that before Lyndon B. Johnson's war on poverty. And all Lyndon B. Johnson's war on poverty created was a huge increase of deficit by a lot. And we spent over $22 trillion just to simply like flatline that. It's just simply like the curve just stayed around the same way.
The supplemental poverty line, which is a far more a supplemental poverty rate, which is a far more comprehensive measurement at poverty, has gone from 24% in 1968 to I believe it's 14% today. That is down to economic security programs like Social Security, like SNAP. These programs keep a million of people out of poverty. That is undeniable.
These programs make things like healthcare much more expensive, right? Essentially, before the
How
oh,
how does
sorry,
Social Security and SNAP
not
make
just
healthcare more
security.
expensive?
I mean Medicare. I'm talking about Medicare, right?
What,
Essentially, because you're
how
bringing
is
up health programs, right?
how has Medicare made healthcare more expensive? Medicare
Because they're
Medicare is a cheaper, more cost-effective healthcare system than private insurance.
well, essentially we could look at it like this, right? In the 1960s, healthcare was before the Medicare, Medicaid were induced, right? A lot of people didn't even need health insurance, and churches were able to cover for the people that couldn't afford it, and everything Medicaid have been incentivized, right? Hospitals have been increasing their prices, where the fact that if you don't have health insurance, it's going to be harder for you to pay healthcare. And the reason that it's so much higher is because when the government subsidizes something, things cost much more. Like essentially, right? So with
This
Medicare and Medicaid,
This is not true. Okay, so Medicare is far more cost effective. So from I believe it's 1990 to 2018, Medicare has increased at a far slower rate than private insurance. The cheapest healthcare you can get in this country is when you're insured by Medicare.
yeah, I mean, of
The
course.
administrative costs of Medicare are far lower than private insurance. So when you say that, oh, it was the government when government subsidizes things, it gets more expensive, that's just patently false.
Well, like healthcare prices have gone dramatically up since the
Yeah,
inception of
and
Medicare.
when you compare prices, when you compare costs of Medicare to private insurance, Medicare is increased at a lower rate. It is more cost effective.
Well, I mean, that would make sense because
You haven't shown a causal relationship yet.
I mean that would make sense for the fact that Medicare would be more. I mean,
And
private insurance would be cheaper because like when you have all these subsidized government insurance programs, people are going to choose that over
yeah, because they're higher quality and more cost efficient. That's why they'll choose it.
maybe that it's like necessarily affordable. I mean, it's not affordable. Like it's necessarily the fact that people can reach out to it easier.
Yeah, that's what you want with the healthcare system.
Well, that doesn't make healthcare any more cheaper. It doesn't make
But again, like Medicare is just a more cost effective system. I don't know how you can deny that.
yeah, because of what resulted. But I believe if
And
without
when we look at healthcare prices really shot up, it was in the 80s, a full like 2 decades after Medicare.
essentially, yeah, it takes time for these social programs to really stack in effect. Like when government started subsidizing colleges, right? Essentially, colleges were not as high as they were now. Like right when government subsidized colleges, And ever since colleges became subsidized, right, college prices started to dramatically increase in
Okay,
price.
so which nation has the most expensive healthcare system per capita?
Us.
Exactly. Wouldn't it, using your logic, wouldn't it be the UK since they have a fully nationalized healthcare system, but they actually have the most cost-effective healthcare system?
It's because of
If
our
if government subsidies increase prices, why is the UK so cost efficient? And same with every other universal or nationalized system. Why are they so much more cost efficient with more government involvement and subsidization?
because with our subsidization, we still allow private companies, which does actually cover us to have more healthcare to provide for, which has us more hospitals. So we have more hospitals in order to cover up, as opposed to like due to less incentive and businesses growing, there are less hospitals in the UK. Essentially, there are way more hospitals in the US.
Um, I believe it's similar, but again, like other universal healthcare or other nations with universal healthcare have both private and public insurance, so they don't have the problem you're talking about. So
I mean, the UK has a fully socialized healthcare system, and
yeah, and it's incredibly cost efficient and very effective at giving high quality healthcare.
um,
I mean,
not yeah,
yeah, according to pretty much every metric, yes.
yeah, people are what was I gonna say? Yeah, healthcare is because healthcare right in the US is when you have like health and when you have the Medicare system, it makes things much more mixed with our private companies. Essentially, makes things much more complicated. And in the UK, it's much more simple to tackle, I
So
guess. But still, like
wait, okay.
you have to look
So
at
if
it
we
like
so if we
2018.
if we scrap the private insurers, we would have cheaper healthcare.
No, because it would cost much
But
more.
that's
I
what you
believe
just said. The UK has cheaper healthcare because they only have to worry about their nationalized healthcare system, no private insurance. That's what I want. It seems like we get cheaper care. You
I mean,
admitted that.
no, I didn't, because there would be less hospitals. There would be less people that hospitals can cover up for.
Why? What makes you say that? I mean, if you look at the hospital beds per capita, the US and the UK are incredibly similar.
Well, we have different. We have a
I
much
believe
big.
I believe the US is 2.6, the UK is 2.5. It's not much different.
I mean, there's essentially is a difference, and plus the U.S. does have more beds. It has more equipment. The U.S. actually does lend some equipment to these other countries. Like essentially, we saw in Britain where they, or not necessarily Britain, but I'm pretty sure they were one of the countries that lacked ventilators for COVID-19 due to our free markets, due to some sort of free market system where we have. We were able to provide other countries with ventilators.
Healthcare beds per capita, the US is 2.8, the UK is 2.5, 0.3 of a difference.
Right, but essentially, we're able to compromise for the amount of people that we need. Like, I mean, due to COVID-19, it was, I mean, the situation wasn't good anywhere, but at least in the US, the
I
situation was.
mean, if you want to bring up how healthcare systems and how they've handled COVID, it's not a good argument for you. The
I mean,
UK has handled it better than the US.
the
Italy has
US,
handled it better than the US. Spain has handled it better than the US.
the US has actually had more testing than these other countries.
Yeah, because we're a bigger country and we've had a worse outbreak. I mean, if you look at the curves and the rate of infections between these countries, the US has handled it worse than any other nation on earth.
Not necessarily, because
Yeah, necessarily.
if you test more people, then that means that you have less people who are gonna have COVID-19. It's
Those other countries like the UK, Italy, Spain, European nations with socialized medicine, they don't need to test anyone anymore because they handled the outbreak well enough to where it's all but over.
How are we sure of that, right? If you don't test anyone, you can't confirm or deny that.
Yeah, they're still testing people and they're not finding cases.
Not at the rate the US is.
Yeah, because the US is actively dealing with a worst outbreak. If you have
But
more people
we
infected, you're going
we
to be
only know
testing
that.
more. So are you trying to argue that the Italy or Spain or the UK has this huge issue that they aren't testing enough? But the thing is, they are testing and they are finding cases to this day, but they have made their outbreak significantly like less serious, so they're finding less cases.
Again, you can't exactly confirm that if you don't test the same amount of people. You don't know if they exhibit COVID symptoms, right?
They're testing at similar rates that they have been this entire outbreak. Their rate of testing is not slowed down. They're just finding less cases because the outbreak is getting better. It's or getting not as bad.
Actually, the U.S. is leading more in tests, believe it or not.
Yeah, I didn't deny that.
Yeah, so essentially, that's the way that we find out that there are more cases.
We have more tests because we have more people.
Right. Let's compare that to. So, do you want to compare this to a country like China or India, where there are more people?
Does
Oh
anybody have
yeah,
a test per capita?
I
Does anybody
mean,
have a test per capita numbers?
China did a much better job at handling it. I don't think you want to compare us. Dude, China tested the entire city of Wuhan in like 10 days. That's over 10 million people.
Do you trust
And
China?
yet China was also.
Yeah, I don't see any reason to not believe their testing numbers.
And if you look at it, there was about like 23 million phones in that city in Wuhan that actually ended up like there was an article about that ended up like being blanked out simply because of. I mean, and China's not even reporting that kind of number, right? Like the fact
China
that there
is
are like many
China is
phones.
reporting their numbers. They've been reporting the numbers the entire time.
I mean, they at one point they were up at 85,000, and then they decided not to report any more numbers since then. Like once
No,
they hit
no,
80,
they have
I
been
mean, they
reporting
have,
numbers this
but, like,
entire time.
they took a while. They took a break from that, right? China at one point capped at 85,000, and then
No,
that
dude,
number.
they haven't stopped reporting their numbers. They just don't have as many cases anymore.
But I'm saying, like, why did China suddenly like stop with those numbers, right?
Because
Why did
they handled the
China?
outbreak well. That's why.
So China would be remained at 85,000, and would then not even have suddenly more cases till like 2 months later.
Because that's what they had about 1,000 cases. They stopped the outbreak, and it has been virtually non-existent since then. Okay,
So
I wanted to get back. You said getting actually back to capitalism. You
mhm.
said it was in line with human psychology. What does that mean?
So essentially, the human drive to do something, right? So the human drive for you to provide crops and grains to someone is due to the fact that you're going to get compensated for it.
But like humans have not always needed profit. Like if we look at previous hunter-gatherer societies and even like the
And then
Incas,
they can trade through materials for that. But right now,
no,
some of
they
those
all resources produced belong to the communities collectively. They had no concept of private property.
they traded resources for that essentially.
Yeah, voluntary exchange has existed as long as humanity has. That's not capitalism.
I mean, that is an argument for capitalism because voluntary exchange means producing your labor in favor of money.
I mean, you can exchange goods within communism or socialism.
But then they're not worth as much, right? If you look at socialist countries, right, they actually look to capitalist countries for like how much, or like before, right, when there was much more widespread socialism, they actually look to capitalist countries for the value of a service or a product.
Like, what's an example of that?
Let's see. Let's see if I can find one. We can look at let's see. We could look at countries like Cuba, which essentially compared a certain service to like how the U.S. relative, or like how a capitalist, not necessarily U.S., served with their value.
I mean, like the essentials in Cuba are like far cheaper than the essentials in the US. Like in Cuba, you can buy like a bag of rice for like 14 cents. It's not really based on the US's prices. I don't know what you're talking about.
I mean, it's due to the fact that people are able to afford more. So essentially, right, in the U.S., people are wanted to produce more as well. So in the U.S., people are producing more crops and grains, and yet these shelves are being taken at the same rate compared to socialist countries because the
I
U.S.
mean,
is
like,
able to
I think
provide.
your argument was that like these countries use the US as a gauge for how much goods are gonna cost, like how much they're gonna like price them
Yeah,
at. That just doesn't happen.
you can base it based on the metric of like how much it costed like for the US to provide or for people in the US to provide compared to like their certain wealth standards essentially.
Uh, Food in Cuba is way cheaper than it is in the US. Like I said, you can buy a bag of rice for like 14 cents. It's not based on the US. They heavily subsidize their food there.
And essentially there's like less food in these countries like Cuba.
Not really.
I mean, you could
I
look
mean,
at the
maybe compared to the US, but compared to other Latin American countries, Cuba does not have a starvation problem, no.
I would put it compared to like Chile, which is essentially the most free market country in South America. And Chile is able to provide for more in terms of resources.
Chile has bigger like housing problems than Cuba. Like slums exist in Chile, they don't exist in Cuba.
The but in like free market countries, right? You see more houses being taken up actually. Like in
What
fact,
I mean, in the Soviet Union and Cuba, homelessness was not a thing. It is a big problem in the US.
see, in Cuba, they actually there's a lot of skewed statistics in Cuba. If you actually look at it. People were incentivized to actually lie about some rates,
Rates of what?
like in terms of their standing.
Housing?
Like
No. Cuba's constitution guarantees housing as a right. And independent sources have found that there's no homelessness in Cuba. Like, same with the USSR. There was no homelessness in the USSR. We have a huge homelessness problem in the US.
but you see, like, look, the 0% homelessness. It seems like how would a country be able to conduce that like every person within their country, right? Even if they don't have like even if they do have homes, right? These homes are typically like not sufficient standard. They're not in a good standard of
I mean,
living.
compared to other Latin American countries, it's very nice.
But if you, well, let's see, Latin American countries have actually relatively dealt with their fair share of problems with socialism, honestly. For all,
No. Okay, so this is a losing point for you, man. Latin America is not socialist.
I'm not saying
Latin
that
America's
they're
problems
now.
are caused by the US's desire to crush socialism. When we look
Yeah,
at the failures of these Latin American countries, they have failed under US-backed authoritarian free market people, not socialists. When the socialists get in power, they're disposed and replaced by people who are very pro-capitalist.
so what about the fact that let's look at countries that actually adopted free market policies over time, right? China is one of them. China is not I wouldn't call it a free market country, but it's relatively adopted more free
In
market
what
policies.
way is China free market?
They've adopted more private sectors. They've allowed more
Yeah,
privatization. They've allowed
a
more.
private sector that is completely owned and controlled or completely controlled by the state.
I'm not saying China is capitalist or free market necessarily, but they've opened it up over time, right? It used to be much more, let's say, controlled by the state in the past.
Yeah, it's not a free market system, so I don't know why you'd bring it up.
I would bring it up because the fact that they've improved, right? They've improved with more privatization in China. You also can bring up Poland
How can you prove that it was the increase in privatization that has caused the reduction in poverty? How can you
because
prove a causal relationship?
because people have been able to have higher standards of living. GDP numbers have gone up, right? In fact, if you actually look at it, income inequality is actually a much less of a problem in free market countries. And
Whoa, that is just not
I'm
true at
it is
all.
It is
There
true.
was there was an analysis done of OECD nations, which are high income, and they found that when you have more free trade, more fiscal freedom, more freedom from government regulation, so free market policies, you have more income inequality. And as China has adopted more private property, more private sector, they have had an increase in income inequality.
Well, according to the Human Development Indicators and Fraser Institute, less income inequality is actually less of a problem in countries that adopted more free market policies or are more economically free.
There's no causal relationship there. You can
How,
say there's a correlation, but you can't show a causal one.
I mean, it would make sense.
I can link you the study of the OECD nations if you really want to, but again, almost all the research done to this says that when you have more free trade, more free like fiscal policy, more or less regulation, you have more income inequality.
We can actually look at this in this way, like the fact that income.
What like economically free policy reduces income inequality?
Probably the fact that people can open their own businesses. There's more entrepreneurship. There's more businesses available. There's more revenue coming in.
I mean, that's very idealistic, but that's not how it works in practice.
I mean, in socialist countries, there's only like the only people that can really have any sort of wealth are like the people that are in control of the government, essentially.
Wait, what do you mean?
Like people that call the shots, essentially, is the authoritarians. So
what do you think socialism is? I mean, I don't support authoritarianism at all.
How are you going to enforce a socialist policy? How are you going to enforce the distribution of wealth? Essentially, how are you going to enforce collectivism?
I support collectivism of when it's workers owning it, not when it's the government owning it.
Well, who's going to enforce that?
The state.
So essentially, you do like a force. Because if you don't believe the government should do it, then essentially you believe
it's authoritarianism in the way the government tells private business owners they can't employ children or they have to pay their workers like workman's compensation. It's legislating like bad business practices out. I mean, if you want to call that authoritarianism, go ahead, but I would not consider it that.
I mean, I would consider
like is telling a business you can't employ children, is that, authoritarianism?
I mean, I'm not an anarchist. I do believe some regulations, but essentially,
are those regulations or authoritarianism?
No, but let me go into this, right? So essentially, with when you have more government control, like you're going to restrict more private businesses being created, more opportunities for people.
Again, there's research into this, and regulation really doesn't inhibit like entrepreneurship.
So why does a capitalist country like the U.S. lead in like more businesses being able to be made?
I mean, we're relatively capitalist, but we still have a lot of innovation, and that innovation doesn't inhibit entrepreneurship.
So what's going to cause people to create these companies? Essentially, people are creating companies for the incentive of profit.
I don't think profit is an incentive, really. Maybe in a capitalist society, but I don't think that's necessary.
So what's going to cause? Well, first off, in a capitalist society, people are able to gain wealth, and with this wealth gain, people are able to create businesses.
Why did people make things before capitalism?
People made things before because that was, there was essentially feudalism, right? Essentially, the system.
I mean, we can go further back, like in hunter-gatherer societies. Why would I produce resources or goods?
People produce resources to survive, essentially.
Yeah, for the good of the community. There wasn't any profit back then.
But people, yeah, well, there was essentially trade. I mean, essentially, you call that.
All goods that were made in those societies were owned collectively by the community. It was the classic like Marxist sense of to each according to his need, for each according to his ability, for each according to his ability, to each according to his need. It was rather Marxist.
But you see, the idea of but that's before civilization was even a thing, right? If you're gonna have
I mean, that was civilization.
civilization like
I mean,
between
and when we're talking about human psychology and human nature, doesn't matter what time it happened in.
I mean, it kind of does for like how we proceed with our ideas, right? Essentially, you can't really base off back when people lived with campfires and like they hunted instead of our. I mean, people still hunt, but like in a different way, in a more productive way, right? Due to human innovation and over time we had trade, and now we do currency, which is our capitalist system instead of feudalism, right? People have been inventing new productive ways. I mean, life expectancy has gone up due to capitalism, essentially, and we're able to provide for more ideas and things and making our life easier.
Um, yeah, I want to get back to some of the stuff I said in my opening statement because I really feel we haven't covered that. Um, so what is your definition of exploitation?
Essentially, like forcing someone to do something under like huge control. So I assume that what you're going to bring up is how in capitalism you're going to need to work for something else you die. But my rebuttal to that is essentially that people had to create something due to causing effort. Right? People are not going to build a house, as I said much earlier. Right? People are not going to build a house or create stuff without an opportunity cost for them. Right?
Okay, so I would argue that my definition of exploitation is taking advantage of one's vulnerability to one's own benefit. That's pretty applicable to capitalism, considering the worker is incredibly vulnerable. If they do not take that job, they're going to die. They have to sell their labor to a capitalist in order to survive.
So are you essentially advertising for a worker co-op?
Yeah, worker co-op is it's not coercive now.
You see, the difference between a worker co-op and a capitalist is the fact that under a capitalist, right, you're going to get profits over time. I mean, you're going to get profits, you're going to get paid. Like let's say I make a crafting business, right? Essentially I'm learning my own ways and I'm teaching, and then eventually I use funds to create a business. I use the materials. I have a certain idea, right? But instead these people want to if these people want to learn how to craft, right, I'm essentially teaching them stuff. I'm essentially using my labor. Why would it be fair for them to own the same amount as I do, despite the fact that I'm teaching them how to craft stuff? I paid for the company, right? If you look at it, the person who loses if a company goes bankrupt is the CEO. The workers can always find a new job. The CEO loses their capital and their effort into the company.
If a worker loses their job, that's pretty much life and death. Like if they're on a subsistence wage, they need that job to survive.
I mean, there's a bunch of other businesses out there due to our innovation entrepreneurship
Okay,
and
so so when one capitalist business that they're having to, sell their labor to in order to survive, when that goes under, they have to go straight to another capitalist in order to survive. Do you see how this is exploitive for the worker?
well, let's say you do a worker co-op, right? How are you gonna get money if the right, at least under a capitalist, these people are constantly getting paid, right? Under a worker co-op, how are
Do you,
these people?
do you not think people get paid in a worker cooperative?
I mean, they do, but they only get paid based on like once their product's successful. Obviously, they need loans, they need bank loans, right? Bank loans aren't just looking to give people out money because the bank needs money in return.
I mean, people get paid just fine under cooperatives.
But these people
In
are
fact,
essentially
there's research that the workers actually get paid better under cooperatives.
that could be true if the product is successful, right? But you see, if we see of a lot of businesses, right, products are not necessarily always going to be successful, right? If you don't have a successful product, you work together in a company. If you don't have anyone who is in charge of the company that funded it in the first place, you're gonna need the company to be successful. Yes, obviously, if there is no capital, if there's no CEO, and your product does end up being successful, you are gonna take in more, of course, because everyone's equivalent to the same forced. But with a capitalist, at least you have a guarantee of having money, right? And you're actually
Cooperatives are more successful. The 5-year closure rate of a cooperative is like 10%. After 5 years, half of like capitalist companies are like done. They didn't succeed.
I
They're
mean, but they still have a certain amount of time where they can succeed and they can earn wages.
This is just not true. They have higher growth rates.
But you see, as you listed, there's only a 10, right? So these companies, right, when you list there's only a 10% rate, right? That 10% rate, it's either that or nothing, right? Under a capitalist, right? They still earn money, right? Maybe not as much as they have their own business as a cooperative.
In what cooperative do people not get paid?
I mean, just look at it like this: who's in charge of it?
The workers.
Right. So who is funding the business?
The workers.
Correct. So if the workers are funding the business, right, they're the ones that essentially paid into it, and they're the ones that essentially need profit from the business. So essentially, there's no one that has an extra amount of money that can continually pay them.
No, it doesn't happen. Like cooperatives, the workers in them get paid throughout its existence. If you can find me one cooperative where people aren't getting paid consistently, I would be stunned.
I mean, people are getting paid due to success and due to the right, but there's no guaranteed income essentially.
You haven't shown me one example of this actually happening.
All right.
I've just never seen this. I've looked a lot into cooperatives, and I've never seen an example of when the workers have to wait to get paid.
So how would they earn money?
In a market setting, cooperatives pay their workers by selling goods.
But let's say the goods aren't successful, right? If the goods aren't successful, they have a net loss. So the reason they are
just like any other business.
But the thing is, with any other business, you have someone that's continuously paying these workers.
Well, unless they literally have no profit, which is unlikely in any business, they're going to pay their workers. Like you're pointing out problems in any business, really.
No, because for someone to even run a business, they need to be able to pay their workers. I mean, most of these people,
so in a capitalist business, if their product doesn't work, how are they paying themselves?
The CEOs, well, essentially they might not be paying. People lose on companies sometimes.
You're just proving my point. That's a problem that could exist in any business.
No, because the workers are getting paid, maybe not the CEOs necessarily. I'm not.
Okay, so if a business is making no profit, their product just isn't selling, how is the CEO paying themselves?
CEO may not actually be paying themselves through effort. They might actually be taking a loss, but at least their workers are getting paid. Because CEOs do take losses on companies.
Again, like I think you're pointing out a problem that doesn't exist in cooperatives. I've never seen one that doesn't actively pay their workers. But another criticism.
I mean, these employees have a certain amount of wealth on the side, and due to our regulatory systems, people are going to have to get paid. But essentially, a privatized owned business by a CEO is essentially going to get paid for more. I mean, yes, obviously, right, a worker cooperative can get paid more if they are successful, right? But that's because of success. But essentially, if you actually compare between the CEO of a private business compared to a worker co-op, and let's just hypothetically say both are unsuccessful, the CEO one is going to get their workers paid even more.
Okay, do you support like a completely unregulated market?
No, I do believe regulations. Like, I'm not a fan of child labor, for example. I've actually seen people argue in favor of child labor. I am not supportive of that. But if you actually look at it, economically free countries actually have less child labor, believe it or not.
Well, because most, quote unquote, economically free nations are developed nations with child labor laws.
Right. So the reason that they're so developed and they have these child labor laws and the fact that they're able to even produce revenue is because of capitalism and free
I mean,
market.
and uh, like developing nations that aren't as economically free are going to have no child labor laws because they need laborers. This doesn't seem very relevant to either side.
I
Like you
mean,
can have an economically free country that has outlawed child labor.
right. And essentially the reason that there are and the fact that the reason are that economically freer countries have less child labor is because they have more labor in terms of inducement and the fact that they have more people that are able to get paid more. And they're able to find success, right? While if we have socialized economies, they essentially need more, what you call it. I mean, they don't need child labor. I'm not gonna be in favor of that, but like I'm saying, like they have child labor because of the fact that they need more workers, essentially because people aren't getting paid anything. The reason why children work in like some of these facilities is because because they need more workers because the family needs more money because there's not enough under a socialist economy.
Yeah,
Or
I just
let's say less
child.
economically free.
I mean, when America was laissez-faire back like 1870s, we did have a problem with child labor,
Of
and of
course, but
course, there.
we've seen more productivity and more GDP ever since we got rid of child labor.
Yeah, I think this is more down to if a country decides if they like child labor or not. You can have it in an economically free country or one that is not. Seems rather
I mean,
irrelevant.
I would say that economically freer countries typically have less child labor because of the fact that they're economically free for reasons listed.
Hmm. Something else. Did you have anything else you wanted to bring up?
Oh, you're asking me?
Yeah.
All right, I could bring up the fact that let's see, what else do I have here? So when you responded to my comment, which is actually how I declared this debate, what countries have you seen that are socialist successes? That you
Okay, well, it depends on what we're defining socialism as and what we're defining success as. I think for the
all right,
sake of arguing, we'll just say any country has declared itself socialist is fair. And then
mhm.
what metric do you want to use to say it worked?
So I would say like countries that are essentially like typically like so with a socialist country, essentially there is less privatization of businesses. Um, I mean, we've
I
seen in
mean,
more.
if we
I
go
mean,
off the metric of standard of living, I would challenge you to find me a socialist revolution or socialist government that did not improve the standard of living of its people.
we could already look at I know a lot of socialists like to bring up the fact that they claim this is not a socialist country, but we could bring up Venezuela, where the government actually nationalized more resources over time from Hugo Chavez. Venezuela is the second least economically free country in the world, just right above North Korea, and people there are essentially starving.
Well, again, Hugo Chavez did a lot for Venezuela. Like there was a huge reduction in poverty, huge increases to literacy, just in general, massive increases to standard of living. Really, the cause of the economic crash was a drop in oil prices.
The reason there was a drop in oil prices is because of government planning, I would say. I
No,
mean,
it was a global drop in oil prices. It wasn't exclusive to Venezuela.
so why do Gulf countries like Saudi Arabia and all these other Gulf countries essentially they're able to produce more wealth from their oil surplus?
Well, Saudi Arabia has backing from the US, so it's not as isolated as Venezuela, which is, you know, basically embargoed. And they weren't as reliant on oil as Venezuela. I believe 95% of Venezuela's exports were oil, and they funded a lot of their social programs through oil. Saudi Arabia doesn't do that.
These Gulf countries actually do not have a lot of these Gulf countries actually don't have even taxes, yet they're able to have social programs. Like you could bring up the United Arab Emirates, you could bring up Qatar, you can bring up
And yeah,
yeah,
they did suffer, but not to the same extent as Venezuela. And again, like
yeah, because
private ownership, private. You brought up private property. Private ownership in Venezuela is like more than Denmark and Norway.
if you actually look at the Economic Freedom Index, as I said, Venezuela is second to last, and
Didn't you
yeah,
say private property was capitalism, and that's what leads to like higher standards of living?
well, private property is a part of it, but there's also rights. So
Venezuela has a lot of private property, more than Denmark and Norway.
these private properties are nationalized; these are controlled by the government. In fact, let me bring
If it's nationalized, it's not private property.
yeah. So I mean, essentially, these let me bring up a study. So essentially, in Venezuela, right, about 1,106. I mean, 1,168 private companies were exported, taken over by the state between 2002 and 2012. So essentially, the company became more socialized, right? So
Yeah,
it
and they
was
had huge improvements in their standard of living.
no, they haven't. I mean, people there are
Yeah, they did.
starving.
I mean, yeah, when oil prices fall over 100%, that's going to cause issues.
Oil prices fell in other countries
25.
too, and there people have,
Yeah,
you
they
want to.
struggled, but not to the extent of Venezuela because of their reliance on oil. It was
I,
uniquely reliant on oil.
I would say these countries rely just as much on oil. I mean, look, like the reason that some of these countries even have alliances, right? I'm not a big fan of the Saudi government, but at the same time, they do get revenue from oil because of yeah, they get revenue from oil due to their international trades.
Is there another country you want to try and bring up that did not improve the standard of living for its
I mean,
people?
Venezuela has not really improved because look, these Gulf countries essentially have higher standards of living. People actually will live there. Meanwhile, Venezuela, there are essentially like empty shelves. People are starving on the streets. People are eating their own pets, and essentially, they're what you call it? It's one of the most violent countries on earth.
Yeah, because the global oil price drop had nothing to do with socialism.
But I would say due to they're just as reliant as oil as these Gulf countries, right?
No, okay. Does Saudi Arabia pay for their social programs through oil?
They gain revenue through oil. I mean, how else? They don't even pay. They don't even have taxes. They are not taxed. So if there are no taxes in these Gulf countries, where do you think they're getting the revenue from?
Again, I didn't know Saudi Arabia had no taxes. Is that true?
I'll bring it up right now. Countries with no income tax.
Well, again, income tax is not the only form of
I mean,
tax.
in general, like these countries actually don't have taxes. Period. I
Yeah,
mean,
Saudi Arabia just tripled their VAT tax.
UAE actually has a sales tax, but they just recently, they just recently came through with that. But yeah, essentially, I could send you this link where there is essentially little to no taxes in these countries, and yet they're able to provide healthcare and stuff despite their reliance on oil. Do you want me to send a link? I mean, all these countries
Yeah,
here.
sure.
Yeah, I got you. I mean, not all of these countries are good because one of these countries that doesn't have a tax is Somalia, but because they're like in a narco-capitalist society. But look at some of these other countries here. You'll see countries like Bahrain and United Arab Emirates, and they're able to provide well despite the fact that they don't have despite that they rely on oil, they don't even have taxes. Oh wait, this is the wrong source. This one didn't have Saudi Arabia. Wait.
Okay, so what is your hypothesis as to why the oil price hit made Venezuela so much worse?
Because they don't have any additional more revenue coming to them because in a very centralized or what do you call it? A command economy. Yeah, that's the word, command economy.
It's not a command economy.
They relatively are. I mean, they're
If it was a
170.
command economy, all enterprise would be owned by the state.
I mean, essentially, their private businesses essentially have over regulatory symptoms and many of
Yeah,
the
but
private sector.
regulation is not a command economy.
Well, I mean, essentially, they are because they are a relatively socialist country.
That's not socialism. When you regulate private business, that's not
I
socialism.
mean, you have like more. The government has more control over their businesses.
Yeah, that's not any definition of socialism I ascribe to.
I mean,
Would
when
you? I mean, I'd consider Cuba a bit of a success considering the factors.
I wouldn't because the country's in poverty, right? There are physicians that don't even want to work there.
I mean,
Yeah,
they have more physicians per capita than any other nation on earth. They have a healthcare and an education system that is the envy of the developing world and comparable to many developed nations. That is remarkable for the amount of economic strain that has been placed on them by the US, the size of their nation, where they were just 50 years ago.
I mean,
Like poverty has been reduced by since the revolution. It was much worse under Fluencio Batista.
maybe because Cuba was never that showcase of a country. And I would argue that
Cuba is infinitely more socialist than Venezuela.
I would argue they are relatively similar in terms of how
No,
horrible.
you can make an argument that Cuba is kind of socialist. There's no argument that Venezuela is socialist.
There is because there's more centralized control. There is a heavy centralized control. Venezuela is the second most repressed country on earth in terms of economic freedom. I mean, if you even want to like debate the fact that Venezuela isn't socialist, right?
Again, so wait, so what metric was Cuba not a success?
I would say the fact that the country is relatively very poor. You have people
But
who
it has gotten better since the revolution. It was significantly more poor previous to that.
you would have people from Cuba that essentially want to immigrate to the U.S.
Okay, well, again, the people who initially immigrated were people who had their land redistributed. They were wealthy landowners.
and essentially you have less of a surplus of businesses going through.
Yeah, they had their land redistributed to the poor. What a heinous crime! And the next exodus in the 90s was because of the dissolution of the Soviet Union. They lost their number one trading partner. That was a huge hit to their economy.
Um, let's see, Cuba. I mean, you could say, but you see, the thing with Cuba is that like people were only able to be sufficient for a while, right? The fact that is Cuba really, and you have to remember the KGB also did prop off some countries, right? Like
Okay.
Cuba is a relatively small country. It's easier
Yeah.
to prop up. Or yeah, and I mean people are very poor over there. Maybe the standards have
Yeah,
been,
they're in
but
significantly better situation thanks to the Cuban Revolution.
I would
Like
I
if you're
would
using your metric of poverty and standard of living, then it was a success. It increased or decreased and improved both of those.
I mean, look at the infrastructure in Cuba. Essentially, you have like houses that are like crumbled. In the U.S., you have like in the U.S. a nearby.
You're okay. Are you actually comparing Cuba to the U.S.?
I mean, you want to compare an individual state,
The Cuba is a
or do you want to compare it to size?
An isolated Caribbean island. The
So
U.S. is an economic superpower. Of course, comparing them is not
why
going to
don't we
bode well
compare?
for Cuba.
They have trade with South America, and do you want to
No,
compare?
they can't trade with South America because of the U.S. embargo. Any country that trades with Cuba gets blacklisted by the U.S.
I mean, there was
It is
trade between Cuba and the USSR.
Yeah, that was the only trade they could do. And when the USSR dissolved, they lost really their only trading partner. That's why their
And
economy got really bad in the 90s.
I mean, yeah, but that essentially, right? The fact that the USSR did all it could to prop up the economy.
Yeah, and it was in the 70s and 80s. Cuba was a pretty good place to live. And in
I would
comparison
argue.
to other Latin American countries, Cuba is nice. There's no slums. Everyone has healthcare. Education is free from kindergarten to a PhD. That is remarkable given the development of the nation.
Let's see this. So let's see through the bar graph. I would argue the fact that Cuba, there was still like there's a lot of slums. There's less innovation and essentially, right? Like let's
No,
compare.
slums do not exist in Cuba.
I mean, there's houses that are crumbling, but okay. Well, let's compare.
Dude, you're talking about Latin America. Find me houses that aren't crumbling in any Latin American country. We're talking about relative. Cuba's housing program is far better than most other nations in Latin America that are capitalist.
I would argue that Chile would have actually better houses.
I mean, Chile has slums. Chile is probably that has the most income inequality, and it does have a housing problem because it's the most capitalist.
I mean, you could.
There's like, have you not been paying attention? There's social upheaval right now in Chile because of the poor living conditions of the lower class.
I mean, you could also credit some methods in Chile.
And Chile has the backing of the West.
I mean, you could argue the fact that
Cuba has effectively become an isolationist state. Chile has become an ally of the West that has helped prop them up.
But you could also argue the fact that there has been, because the fact that there was a socialist person elected in Chile, but then with,
Allende, he brought a lot of improvements to Chile.
With Pinochet put into power, right, there caused a lot of civil conflict, civil unrest. So I could argue that is a pretty big problem in Chile. But we could also
Pinochet was a capitalist.
I know. I'm saying that due to civil unrest because he was forced into power, right? I'm not a big fan of U.S. coups.
You can thank capitalism for that.
You could also thank the KGB for forcing socialist coups.
When did the KGB do a coup?
I mean, you could not necessarily coup, but the USSR spread its influence to China. They spread their influence through Vietnam through force, right? This is not.
But, I mean, to my knowledge, the USSR never overthrew a government.
I mean, to an extent, they did because they forced their military, they forced their soldiers into China, and then essentially China forced their military to Korea, which the U.S. actually came in response to that. The U.S. sided with the South Koreans in response to the Korean takeover through the socialists. Or
the U.S. has attempted or overthrown about I think it's 55 foreign governments. Almost all of them because those countries had elected leftists who challenged the capitalist class.
I mean, I would argue the fact that that doesn't dispute the fact that the USSR tries to influence and actually makes countries worse, right? So you see the USSR is influencing.
Okay, first of all, the USSR didn't do that. They never overthrew a government. Secondly, that's just a deflection. That has nothing to do with the capitalists overthrowing other nations.
I mean, when you argue the fact that capitalists overthrowing other nations, you have to look at the fact that the USSR, right? The fact that they may have not overthrown, but they had their influence.
You're just deflecting.
They sent KGB members. They sent people to influence these countries.
You're just deflecting.
I'm not deflecting. Yes,
you are. You're not addressing the argument.
I'm addressing the fact
capitalists have staged coups in foreign governments. That's the argument.
Yeah, I'm not denying the fact that the U.S.
Okay, then don't deny it. Don't shift blame to the USSR who didn't do that. They never overthrew a foreign government.
They sent KGB troops all over the world. They had influences in Korea. They had influences in China. They had influences in Vietnam. They had influences. They tried to spread to Afghanistan. Now Afghanistan is debatably where it is today because of the USSR.
Again, Afghanistan is an example of another country that had a leftist overthrown by the U.S. I think it was Yahya Khan, who was a bit of a genocidal maniac.
The Afghanis actually rebelled against the Soviets, believe it or not.
We're talking about two different events here.
Yeah, but like the USSR came to Afghanistan. They essentially invaded Afghanistan, and essentially for the US's response, they funded a group, but the group already had motives. The Afghans did not want the USSR in their presence. So you can see the USSR did use some imperialistic tactics.
Yeah, I'm
If you
not
want,
denying that. I'm not denying that.
but you were just blaming the shift on the capitalists.
Yeah, because capitalists do that. You said
Yeah,
you're not going to deny that.
I mean, I'm not denying the fact that there are coups overthrown. I mean, there were coups that overthrew people, right? I'm not going to deny that happened, but at the same time, you have to look at the USSR also did the same thing, right?
Okay,
They
I
tried,
mean, to a lesser extent, but it's again, this is not the point. I brought up imperialism as a criticism of capitalism. If the U.S. and USSR engaged in more minor imperialism, okay, that's bad too.
but I mean, essentially, that's the point that you can't necessarily focus the blame on the capitalists.
I can though.
I mean, that would be essentially like that doesn't prove anyone's point.
Yeah, it does. I can give you specific reasons as to why the capitalists wanted those governments overthrown. In Chile, Salvador Allende nationalized the copper industry. There was an American copper company that owned a lot of Chilean copper. That's why they overthrew him. Capitalist interests.
You could argue the fact that the USSR overthrew people to gain its power. Essentially, what the
You're
USSR
just
did.
deflecting.
No, I'm not. I'm saying the USSR invaded nearby countries. So while they invade nearby countries, because that's the only way they could stabilize their economy, due to having more, land available to them, due to having a more pushes towards the USSR. That's the only way USSR was able to sustain themselves for even the amount of time they did.
Can you blame imperialism on capitalism? Does capitalism encourage imperialism? Yes or no?
No,
Oh
I
my
would
good lord.
argue.
Okay, so what about Chile? What about Chile then? Salvador Allende, why did he get overthrown?
Well, let's look at this like this, right? Capitalism is the negotiation of competition and private enterprises between each other, right? Imperialism is essentially a monopoly, right? It's essentially enforcing themselves onto these countries. That's not capitalism. Capitalism is free ownership. It's between voluntary exchange.
There
Honestly,
was there
imperialism is
was
not. Imperialism
there
is
was an American company in Chile that owned a lot of copper. Salvador Allende, a socialist, nationalized the copper industry. That made them very mad. They went to the US and said, "Hey, can you overthrow him?" The US was like, "Sure." Boom. That's how it happened. It had capitalist influence.
I mean, you could
That
argue
was
the
not a product of capitalism.
I mean, you would argue there is some greed, there's some lobbying, but I would not specify that on the ideas of capitalism, right? There are
Why
certain
not?
because capitalism is mutual exchange. It's not through
Do capitalists not act in what is best for their profit?
but that's not private exchange. I mean, of course they do act what's best for the profit, but they do not.
Okay, what was best in that capitalist company's profit was to overthrow a government. They had enough wealth, they had enough power to do that.
But that's not an example of capitalism because
Yes,
capitalism.
it was done by a capitalist company. If they didn't have capital, it wouldn't have happened.
I mean, you could. I mean, that's not capital because that's essentially enforcing a monopoly.
What do you
Monopoly not a good example of capitalism.
What do you mean?
Like, I mean, that company demanded military influence. They demanded a influence in the country. That's essentially like enforcing a monopoly.
Okay, I mean they got the monopoly legitimately.
Not legitimately through if it's through the invasion. And if we
It,
actually look,
it wasn't through an invasion. They just owned the copper.
I mean, they asking the CIA to overthrow it. And
Yeah,
essentially,
because Salvador Allende had nationalized copper.
I mean, essentially, this is that essentially is not capitalism because
What
you
do you
could,
think? Capitalism is the private ownership of capital.
yes, I'm aware, but that's not how you use right capitalism because
There was a
capitalism,
private company in Chile that did not want their profits nationalized.
essentially what you're talking about is probably
They're
corporatism, lobbying Congress, where Congress is using a military coup to enforce ideas onto or force coups, right? That's corporatism essentially.
Yeah, that's a symptom of capitalism.
I would argue not to. I would argue not because essentially in socialism, right?
Okay, I just want you to answer this question. In capitalism, do companies not act what is what is in the best interest of their profit?
Yes, but essentially in capitalism, right? There are like
So if it's in a capitalist company's interest to lobby the government or overthrow a foreign leader, how is that not just capitalism?
because that essentially involves lobbying Congress, right? Capitalism is a private internship between two
But you
voluntary
just
citizens. That's
said
not it.
capitalists will act in their own profit interest.
I know, but they act in their own profit interests under the guidelines, right? I mean, I don't believe that invading other countries is essentially a form of capitalism.
Eh,
Because I mean, you could argue that under socialized countries, right? You would have less companies.
Capitalism caused it. That's undeniable because it was a capitalist company that wanted the government overthrown.
I mean, I would argue that's not the example of capitalism, honestly. And if you want to bring up
I can bring
invasion,
up another example.
just look up.
In Iran, Mohammed Mossadegh nationalized what is now known as British Petroleum. So the British government went in and overthrew him. Again, capitalist interests
I
causing
mean,
a
you
coup.
I mean, you could argue the fact that the USSR, right? They invaded nearby countries in order to like get more influence, in order to
This is
gain more
irrelevant.
power.
This is irrelevant to my point of capitalism causing
Not
imperialism.
irrelevant because in order for
Yes, it is.
socialism to
You're
sustain, no,
deflecting. You're deflecting big time.
I'm not deflecting. In order for socialism to sustain, right, you need these countries to, like, in order for socialism to sustain, like, you need more people, you need more jobs, and the only way you can get more jobs is through invasions. But in capitalism, at least you have more people competing for profits.
Yeah, they're competing for profit. That's why they want the government's overthrown.
That's not an example of capitalism. That's corporatism. And essentially, if people are really acting under the capitalist system, they would simply compete with these other businesses, right?
Wait, okay, so the capitalists, they're getting their business nationalized. What are they meant to do?
Nationalizing a company is not capitalism.
No, okay, what I'm saying is there's a capitalist nation and a foreign government and they're getting nationalized. What are they meant to do?
Essentially, I would say, I mean, if they are in a foreign nation, I mean, I don't think if they've agreed to all the terms, I don't think the foreign nation has any right to destroy the business as long as they had an agreement. But at the same time, I believe that foreign business should also compete with the government, essentially, if you want to put it like that.
Okay, so you're telling capitalists, just lay down and accept the fact that your industry or your business is getting nationalized. I
I
mean,
mean,
it makes total sense. If you're a capitalist and your business is getting nationalized, of course you're going to run to the US to stop that. That's in your own profit interest. If you don't do that, your business is gone.
essentially, the country is disagreeing to their own terms. You've agreed to the terms, the fact that you're competing for a capitalist profit. Essentially, the only like if you're going to nationalize an industry, all of a sudden you're essentially breaking a contract.
I mean, I would agree. Like, if you're getting nationalized, you shouldn't, you know, go overthrow a government. You should just, I'm in favor of nationalization of industries. So,
Yeah, but I'm saying like all of a sudden having a nationalized industry that was not previously nationalized breaks the contract. So if you're breaking a contract, essentially like these companies should at least be compensated for that by the government that suddenly decides to change. Right?
again, this whole discussion begun because I said capitalism encourages imperialism because private companies are going to go to the foreign governments to protect their profit. You agreed to that. You said that they're going to do that.
I didn't say that they're gonna they're gonna do what they want, but that's essentially corporatism, which I don't feel is capitalism.
How
Lobbying
is
is not
how is
capitalism
corporatism not just a product of capitalism?
because capitalism is
Okay,
private entity
what
for
what
competition.
economic system allowed them to get that much wealth and power?
Well, you could clearly look at socialism could and didn't, but like I'm gonna use as an example, socialism could
No,
and
okay. What
certain industries
economic
have
system allowed them to get so much wealth that they can lobby the government?
I mean, if you want to argue that the company wouldn't even be created, you could argue the company wouldn't be created, but then there would not be these jobs. There would not be any industry to nationalize, period, without capitalism.
I just want you to answer the question. What economic system allowed corporations to get so much wealth and power they can lobby the government?
But again, you're not even tackling anything I'm saying.
I just want you to answer the question. What economic system allowed that to happen?
I want you to answer this question.
It was capitalism. That's the answer. It was capitalism that allowed them to get that much wealth and power. That's just a natural result.
I mean, you could
Like,
argue that,
what are they meant to do with that wealth? Just let it sit there? No, they're going to use it to further their own profit.
or they could make the company like they could add improvements to the company. They could add more advertising material. They have other methods to expand their profits. Maybe grow another company where you add more workers. Because under socialism, you're gonna have a lack of people that are employed, right? Or else they're set to fixed wages, which won't be able to really like help them advance anymore. Because under socialism, you're kept in a certain cap.
Again, you said that that's corporatism. Corporatism is a result of capitalism, which allows corporations to get that much wealth and power. When you allow
I
that
mean,
kind of sharing of wealth to happen, what do you expect them to do?
you could also argue the fact that but that simply also dodged but what I said about you could also argue under socialism there'd actually be less corporation. I mean, there's less corporation, so essentially the government has to
I mean, in
focus on.
socialism, a corporation wouldn't exist.
I mean, these companies or any sort of facility is going to be directized by the government under socialism.
I don't want to be directed
Because
by the government.
yeah, I mean, government was going to have more influence on them as opposed to capitalism. Because at least under capitalism, you'll have more people to compete with them and less money that will be influenced.
Any other topics?
So we're gonna wrap this up here. One last topic, just touch on it for like 5 minutes. End on the morality of each of your preferred systems.
Yeah,
I
I mean,
will let you go.
capitalism is a system which relies upon the workers selling their labor to a capitalist in order to survive. I don't believe that's a very moral system. Also, capitalism doesn't have morality. Decision making under capitalism is based on what's profitable. If doing something good is profitable, capitalists will do it. If doing something bad is profitable, capitalists will do it. There's fundamentally no morality.
I mean, I'd argue otherwise because I believe that incentive helps people want to create more businesses which hire people to afford their needs, which enables people to have more goods and services available to access. And I'd argue due to capitalism, we've had more innovations in medicines, vaccinations, hospitals, jobs, essentially. More people can further their lives even more. And yeah, I'd argue that capitalism has given more ideas. I mean, I mean, there's a higher survival rate. People are living longer. People are due to capitalism innovation. People are living longer. People have higher standards of living.
Yeah, I would argue that none of that is relevant to capitalism, but
I mean,
you
I'd
can have
argue
those you
that's
can
the
have
reason.
those increases in non-capitalist systems like life expectancy. Again, show me a capital or a socialist country or socialist revolution that has not increased life expectancy.
I mean, life expectancy as a whole has increased due to free trade and all these ideas. I believe that
Okay, so in Mao's China, where there was no free trade really, how did life expectancy increase by double?
I mean, due to living standards from other countries. I mean, there were increasing standards in other countries due to more capitalist influence, which had other resources to actually spend and they could actually give to these other countries for a trade,
Wait,
right?
what? I'm talking. Okay, so I'm wondering. I don't know if I phrased that right. Mao's China had a doubling of its life expectancy.
Yes, but essentially, right, these resources in capitalist countries could be given to these other countries.
No one was giving resources to Mao's China.
In Mao's China, you have to kill.
What capitalist company was giving to Mao's China?
I mean, in Mao's China, over 50 million people died because of
starvation. I don't really defend Mao, but you brought up life expectancy as a result of a capitalism. But again, it's irrelevant because obviously Mao was not a capitalist, and there was a doubling of life expectancy.
I mean, I'd argue the fact that there is a life expectancy because there's more resources to go around. Because if you have less of a population, you can get more resources around. Honestly,
so again,
people. Because if you starve people,
also again, the USSR, another country with a huge increase to life expectancy. But there was no capitalist company giving or capitalist country giving to the USSR.
I mean, in capitalist countries, because they are able to kill off their population to have more.
So how did the USSR increase its life expectancy?
Because while there were people that were dying, the people that did live, they had more resources that they could give to them. Meanwhile, these other countries, these other capitalist countries, they didn't have to kill off their population and increase life expectancy.
All right.
All right. And was there anything else you guys need to hash out, or?
Not really.
An hour and a half here. Thank you guys for coming on again, and thank you for everyone that watched. We had a peak at 40 on at one time, so it's decent. So yeah, guys, thank you again. We'll see you guys at the next debate.